Good morning, Colleen.
Morning, it's great to meet you.
Yes, you too.
How you doing?
Very well. Literally having it set up because he dropped the keys to me like 20 minutes ago.
Oh, aye.
And I've just spent 20 minutes trying to find my keys. But anyway.
You're in?
I'm in now, so I haven't set up yet. Can I get you a cup of tea?
I'd love a cup of tea, that'd be great, thank you.
Well, we'll go down the other side and then we'll go into the other studio.
Brill. This is a really cool space.
Yeah.
Welcome to a very special extra mess episode, a bonus episode, if you will. If this is your first time listening to Excuse the Mess, my name's Ben Corrigan. I'm the host and creator of the podcast. What normally would happen is that I'd speak to the guest and then in the afternoon make a track with them using just one instrument and electronic manipulations of it. But for this episode and a few more to come, I'm just going to be chatting to the guests, basically doing half of what a normal episode would be. So I'm really excited that Hannah Peel was up for joining me for the first of these smaller episodes. Hannah is a composer, multi-instrumentalist, electronic musician and producer, a vocalist, a songwriter, an occasional BBC Radio 6 music presenter, and the night before we met up, she was on stage with Paul Weller and the London Met Orchestra, conducting her orchestrations for that show. So she got a lot on. I was very grateful that she was up for making time for me whilst she was doing a stint in London. You're going to hear plenty of Hannah's brilliant music throughout this episode. I really hope that you enjoy it and you spend some time discovering it properly for yourself rather than just these little snapshots of different moments. We only really talk about the last two albums that she's made. Most recently, Mary Casio, To Cassiopeia, which is a spectacular brass and synth-fueled space odyssey. The first track on the album is even called Goodbye Earth. Taking care of the brass side of this music is Tubular Brass, a 29-strong brass band from the north of England, and you'll discover Hannah's deep ties to this brass banding world because of her formative years growing up in Barnsley. Mary Casio is a character that Hannah invented, a sort of musical alter ego, but this persona was actually invented whilst Hannah was making her previous album, Awake But Always Dreaming. Now I won't say too much about it because that's what Hannah will be going into shortly, but I will say that that album was dealing with very personal things in Hannah's life, specifically her grandmother's Alzheimer's. Hannah speaks very eloquently and openly about it, and in many ways that's the point of the album. It's to encourage conversation and to shine a light on the subject. Before just getting on with it, I need to say a thank you to Noted Fellowship for their continued support of the project, and also to Isotope, the genius audio software developers. Now there's no real starting point to this episode, such a pro. We're going to jump right into a gig anecdote about an unimpressed looking crowd. So you were saying, we were talking about gigs and stuff, and you were going to talk about an Orkney gig.
So I still am. We just kind of come together every so often, this band called the Magnetic North, or a collective, should I say. We did an album based on the islands of Orkney called Symphony of Magnetic North. And as part of that, we went up to Orkney and performed in St Magnus Cathedral, the only cathedral on the islands, on the mainland. And it was part of a classical festival, St Magnus Festival. It was like sold out. We had a choir from an island, so they all came on a boat, especially to do the gig. We had local string players, brass people. So it was a massive kind of show.
Yeah.
And a lot of the audience were a lot older. It's quite loud and dramatic music as well as, very tiny. And so that it's very diverse. And on the front row and a few rows behind, there was quite a few older people, like with their fingers in their ears.
Yes, good.
And then, or like falling asleep. Or one of the guys that Erlen spotted was one of his ex-teachers, and he had his fingers in his ears and looked like he was hating it throughout the whole gig, like he was frowning. So we just thought, this is like the worst show we've ever done. Everybody here hates it. Yeah. And then the next day, he was walking down the street and his teacher saw him and said, that was the best thing I've ever seen in my life. I had to turn down my hearing aid because it was so loud, but I loved it. It was like I could feel it in my soul.
Oh, that's wicked.
So, it's not like about one person liking a show. It's all about what the atmosphere is that you create and what you're trying to say. And sometimes people look a bit kind of disjointed or look a bit like disinterested, I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd hate to see that guy's face when he wasn't enjoying something. If he looked quite grumpy when he was just having the best time. Here's a lovely calming magnetic north track called Stromness. I reckon people at your gigs have a sense of wonder on their faces, which is sort of what I get from the music. You know, it really takes you somewhere cosmic. I'm obviously talking about Mary Casio, A Journey to Cassiopeia. It's one of my favourite albums.
Oh,
very sincerely
thank you.
say that. Yeah, I absolutely love it. Yeah, I mean, you just sort of made this thing which is, it doesn't need like a program note. You just turn it on and
you just go,
put your headphones on as well. Great headphone listen. And it just transports you a bit. So, I mean, it'd be great to hear the journey of Mary Casio. Where's that all kind of coming from?
Well, the very, very root of it came from the record previous to that in 2016 was Awake But Always Dreaming. And, you know, that was a very personal record because it was kind of marking the process of how I felt about living with my grandmother's dementia as she was living with it. So, you know, her hallucinations, the worlds that she was kind of delving into, the past, believing she was in, you know, the 1950s on a daily basis, or situations that really upset her at the time when she was like 21. She was reliving those things as if she was there. And for a musician and a composer, and she was a singer, I didn't know how to handle any of that. So there was a lot of kind of me discovering the impact of music and what that can do and connect you again when you think you've lost someone. But the other side of the album was the research side, so that I could feel like I could talk about dementia and Alzheimer's fully and understand the statistics and what happens, and that it is a disease, it's not just getting old. And how can we bring more, I suppose, marketing and promotion to it to make people realise that actually this needs more funding. It's like, you know, 20 years behind cancer.
Yeah.
And it's the biggest killer in the whole of the world.
Yeah.
Like 1 in 3 of us will be affected by it. And that's scary if you think of all the memories and things you build and you make as your personality. So, but going back to kind of where the Mary Casio started was I went to see, and she's become a friend, a lady who's a researcher for Alzheimer's Research UK, and she's based at UCL, and she's won quite a lot of like awards in her research, and she basically grows brain neurons in Petri dishes so that they can then analyse them in the lab and see what's happening as they grow and if they can find a cure, basically.
Yeah.
And she said, come to the lab, I'll show you the Petri dishes.
Yeah.
And so I went and found out loads more. And when I saw the neurons, it just looked, with, you know, like with the microscope being round, it just looked like you were looking at the moon or you were looking at the universe. And there was all these little specks, and that was the start. It was so insane that I just was like, oh my God, this is the moon, or this is the star constellations. It just kind of put in my head this idea of us being part of the universe and part of the world, which is something we are and we forget about because we get so self-consumed with what is happening right now in the moment, or politics. For ages, I was just trying to kind of think of, when I'd started writing Mary Casio, I had this image in my head, but I was trying to think of a way that I could communicate that. And so I started reading about things like string theory and researching physicists, and you know, like I'd seen this thing online about like how string theory, people think that it's God talking to them, and like the airwaves. And we'd performed Mary Casio by this point, but it wasn't released or anything. It was just for a commission. And this is a long-winded way of telling you this story.
It's all great. It's gold.
But something happened live that none of us expected. And looking back now, I can analyse it because I know of the sound, but in the room at that time was something so powerful with the sound that was happening in the air that everybody started to cry. Like, it was just one of those moments of like, there is something moving through the air and you could feel it.
Yeah.
And, now I know it is the like kind of the sub of the synths, the sound effects that are kind of swirling through the room, the breath of like 30 brass players as they breathe in and out, and then like the kind of the synths that are like, the top end higher frequencies.
Here's Goodbye Earth, the opening track from Journey to Cassiopeia.
So the brass is basically taking care of all that middle, melancholy, gut-wrenching stuff. And then the synths are taking care of like the bigger, grander ideas of the world and the universe. So it makes you feel tiny.
Synths and brass, they blend so well. It's just so beautifully put together, and they have like this grey area between them. I haven't quite heard anything like it.
Yeah, you wouldn't know, and I think that was really important. Was personally when like producing as a recording, if you listen to traditional brass band records, it's very reverberated. It's missing a lot of that low end. And I grew up. When we moved to Yorkshire, I played the trombone, so I kind of played in brass bands, but I was always in the lower section of the brass band, so I felt that kind of power that on recordings is always missing from them, because it's always focused on the cornets and the higher end melodies and stuff. And so it was really important when we were recording that and especially when I was scoring the music, that a lot of focus came from the lower end, and also that there wasn't, sometimes you don't know if there's a distinction between what the brass is. And,
exactly, yeah.
And that was really important. Some of the effects went onto the brass, but also I think when orchestrating it was all written electronically. There was no brass intended in the very beginning.
Okay.
It was just all synths.
Yeah.
And so actually my job in the very beginning was hard, because I had to give away synths that I really loved to like somebody else.
Yeah.
But actually that blend then meant that it did work in a way. So we kept on the recording, I didn't edit out all the spits or the breaths or the foot squeaks. Yeah. So it does feel like you are in the room. And the same with the synths. They have like a breathing sound because some of them are broken. It just makes it feel like it's an alive, organic thing.
Andromeda M31. I had a very focused listen. You know, when you just want to have no distractions, so I actually just lay on the bed and put the headphones on, put my phone the other side of the room. And the very first track, I noticed for the first time towards the end, there is loads of the breath things from the players. It's sort of like in surround sound. It's always a really beautiful thing to leave in, really human.
Yeah, human. I think that's the point of it. I think it came at a time when the referendum was happening. I had a lot of anger about the whole thing, and especially because I'd set this kind of character from in Yorkshire, in Barnsley, and there was always these TV shots of people going and interviewing people in Barnsley and just coming across as the most backward place, because it was always the guy on the corner that has probably never left Barnsley that was complaining about immigrants, and you're like, you haven't a clue. So I suppose for me it was quite ironic and felt like a little bit of a kind of a comedy to take a brass band into space from Yorkshire. It's like saying sod you. We're all connected and we're all in the same world together.
Is the brass band community aware of Journey to Cassiopeia?
Yeah, definitely.
I imagine there's, like with any sort of thing with deep traditions, there's going to be some real purists that don't like things, but have you managed to break through that?
Because of the level of the players in tubular brass, I mean, it's a mix of all the kind of championship sections that you will have heard of, like Black Dyke or Grimethorpe Colliery Band and Fairies, and so there is an expectation of that level and people that are brass fanatics. For me, I didn't really think about that. I was thinking more about the electronic side of the world and introducing them to something else. I think in some ways a lot of people were really surprised. I know the brass band members themselves were really shocked when they heard the recording, and I'm blown away because when we've done it live and when they'd heard it, they were just playing. If you think about it in terms of technicality, they're not playing anything really that technical. It's more reliance on their breath and tone rather than playing a passage that's really fast, or I gave them a lot of repetitive rhythms. A lot of the cornets that would be used a lot were underused. I think there was a general feeling among everybody in that world when I first came with the scores and everything of like, oh dear.
Big sigh.
Yeah, what is this? And that was quite hard because a young lady coming into a room that is 90% male that are used to playing in one way and that is it. And so that was difficult until we did the first show. And also then they heard the recordings, and because when they're doing it live, the speakers are coming out front, they don't have monitors, so they're not getting that experience of what you're hearing as an audience member. So it wasn't until the recording came out that they all really started to change towards me and accept me more.
Must be nice, you won them over.
But I think there definitely was that element of like, what is this? It's just some young buck coming. But I'm glad, and I, from playing in brass bands, I knew exactly what sound I wanted, and I think that comes with like your creative DNA, like drawing out the things you know and are ingrained in you.
Life is on the horizon.
I was reading a book at the time called 7 Lessons in Physics by Carlo Rovelli, the Italian physicist. And in there was some beautiful quotes of like his experiences of physics and space and cosmology. And one of the lines was like, we have 100 billion neurons in our brains, as many as there are stars in the galaxy. And when I read that was like, that's it, that's the quote, that's the thing I need to connect the last album with the new one and why I've done it.
You do sound very inspired by science and well researched in your music. Like, could you have been a scientist, do you think?
Do you know when I was tiny, I always wanted to be like a detective, and I had like these like detective magazines and spy magazines. And I do, as I get older, I do see the parallels between that kind of investigative nature, be it in music or be it in science or in the law, or you know, I think there's an element of like constantly exploring, finding more out about yourself and finding out more about the world as you go, and I feel happier with the music that I create as the older I get, because I feel like I'm delving into it and having more courage and confidence than I did when I was in my 20s.
There's something really cosmic about that brass sound that you've really utilised. I've wondered if you've maybe managed to pinpoint what it might be about brass instruments. Is it like just cultural, or is there something like more like physics based about brass instruments that sounds so like interstellar?
Oh, yeah, I think there's two answers. There's definitely the cultural side and our association as Britain, and especially our kind of recognition of that sound. It's a self-released album. I don't know how it would be received if it was released in, say, Australia or somewhere. But definitely here, there's that melancholy, that look at the past, especially the strikes of the miners, that sound that you can only get in very specific parts of Britain. And it is a disintegrating culture. Like, it's really fading. But also, I think, like, physics-wise and the sound palette-wise, there's something about the hugeness of these huge instruments, and for me it was more like, if you think about like a brass instrument, it feels like an alien, because it's a voice coming through a metal instrument and being manipulated, and it is an alien voice at the end of it. It's not like, it felt like that's what maybe would speak to a lot of people and make it cosmic, and also, you know, that grandness and stuff that you can't, when you look in space and you look from Earth, you just can't comprehend that is what is happening, that we are just a speck, and not even a speck, we are smaller than a speck.
Throughout the whole album, you just have these very vivid pictures painted for you. I mean, that's why I say that it's an album that doesn't need a program note, because it's just so evocative of, you know, space. And did you have pictures in your mind?
Yeah, I think so. Gradually it came together that there was a story and a thread.
Yeah.
And I did write an extra track called Cassiopeia, and it was like an extra, she actually got there. But then when I'd kind of written The Planet of Past Souls as it is, I couldn't get any further. Like, I think the sound of my grandfather singing at the end. Could
you elaborate on that? Because it's a really beautiful thing.
So he's singing a classical piece, and it's from 1927 when he was 13. And he was like one of the first choir boys to ever be recorded. It was recorded in Manchester Cathedral. And then it was put out on Columbia Records, but they'd wanted to re-record him to make a better recording, and they went back and his voice had broken. So they used that original recording, and I remember it being played at his funeral. This is, you know, maybe 15 years ago, and found it on YouTube. And I suppose as a kind of nod back to that, the Mary Casio character, and is the fact that I kind of had her in my head as quite an old lady and that had always had a dream of going somewhere but had never been, and then was finally going to go. Or does she make it? And it kind of posed this kind of question of like these sounds from your past, like kind of being drawn out into a planet's atmosphere as if like, you know, like this alien landscape, and then things that you have not quite got a hold of anymore are just taken and blown into the wind. And it just felt like that was the end. That I couldn't go any further. And that then posed the question of, well, did she actually go? Was this all like part of her imagination, or is this her passing into another life? Is this what happens when you get to the end of your life? Things just kind of get drawn out and float away, and that energy then passes on.
I'd like to listen to that album at the end of my life. Great.
Thanks.
What a way to go. I'm hoping that you might stick around to the end of the episode, where I'll be playing you that extract of her grandfather's singing and how she's incorporated it into the sound world of the album. This track is Sunrise Through the Dusty Nebula.
So yeah, there was a kind of a journey in my head of like, I'm going to have some fun, and I'm going to, because I'd not done a full instrumental album before. I'd done instrumental tracks on records, but not a full album. So there was an element of being and becoming Mary Casio so that I could just let go. Yeah. And I think that was a really useful tool for writing, and I'd love to kind of revisit her again and see where she might have gone before she left planet Earth.
Yeah. It's great, the character allowing you to write more freely. Do you feel constrained by Hannah Peel?
I really did. I don't now. When the Awake But Always Dreaming came out, I sat with my manager and I said, I don't want to do it as Hannah Peel. I don't want it anymore. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just don't want the pressure of it anymore. Maybe I should just come up with a different name, and then I can be under that name and then have Hannah separate. Yeah. And he was just like, please, just this one album, just do it as Hannah. And I was like, okay. So, you know, I think Mary fulfilled that side of like wanting to do something different. And it also taught me a lesson in terms of writing and taking yourself out of it and taking I do find lyric writing really difficult in terms of trying to express what I want to say. And I really found that writing Mary Casio, that because I didn't have the pressure of writing lyrics, I could just express more, and I think that comes across. So
totally what I experienced, yes, because the message that I'm receiving is just as powerful if there were lyrics throughout. For instrumental music, that's a hard thing to do, I think. So yeah,
thanks, Ben.
That's why it's a fave. It's on all the time. As Isotope are a supporter of this podcast, I'm just going to have a little brief interlude here to demonstrate one of the tools as part of RX Audio Editor, and that's the Spectral Denoise tool. I'm mixing some jazz music at the moment. It's a live gig, and one of the microphones was really buzzy throughout. So I'm using RX to clean it up. Here's the original buzzy sounding piano. And this is the cleaned up version. Much better. Thanks, Isotope. We're going to step a few years back now and talk about Hannah's second last album, Awake But Always Dreaming. We touched upon this earlier in the episode when we talked about where Mary Casio came from. We don't really talk about anything technical musically, it's more about Hannah's experience of her grandmother's Alzheimer's.
Running wild inside, thoughts are on repeat. You turn onto your side, in silence we can sleep. Whatever you have done, whatever's going on, wherever you have been. I am made of stone, don't take it out on me, don't take it.
A lot of people are affected by it. There is a lot of albums out there already that are about losing memory or losing someone through dementia or Alzheimer's, and I didn't really want to be kind of moping about, because a lot of the time spent with my grandmother was, you know, very upsetting, like deeply upsetting, but also really fun and hopeful, and, you know, like, you know, on the comedy side of things, she would say to like my dad and my brother, like if they arrived, she'd be like, "Oh, are you my lover?" And we used to laugh and, you know, like have a joke about it, and my dad would be like, "No, I'm your son." But, you know, you step away from that and it's heartbreaking. But yeah, so the album was more about that kind of that hopeful pat on the back and saying, you know, if we start to think about this and talk about this, and you know, over the last 2 years, I think anyone would agree that the amount of press, online media, social aspect of us talking about stuff rather than hiding it, because I think it was a real taboo thing of like, people were so upset by these things, they didn't want to talk about it. Also, there was that kind of fear that it wasn't a disease, it was like, you know, something that happens when you're old. So you just accept it as someone growing old.
Don't take it out on me, 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 don't take it out on me. That is made of stone, heart breaks easily. Don't take it out on me, don't take it out on me, don't take it out on me, don't take it.
That track was Don't Take It Out on Me.
For me, it was really important that, you know, it was my grandmother. It was my mum or dad, which a lot of older, you know, if you're in your 40s or 50s, you're talking about your mum or dad. It was my grandmother, and I didn't have a way to connect with her, and I didn't know how to do it. And I think when I found out the kind of intricacy of what music could do, like the almost unbelievable effects it has on people, like where they just don't know where they are, what they're doing, or who you are, and then all of a sudden they're singing lyrics and songs and they remember it perfectly, word for word. You're like, how is that possible? So there was an element of me like discovering why that is, and you can read a lot about it and the neurology behind it, but there was also an element of me wanting to tell people our age and younger that you can connect with your grandparents and feel like they're still alive and with you by playing their favourite tracks, putting a playlist together for them, like, you know, letting them listen to stuff and talking about it and having a dance. I think, you know, gradually there will be more people that if they're in a care home, there is a little bit more incentive to giving people that are living in nursing homes something to live for rather than kind of just like, you know, I think one of the things that upset me the most was going to see my grandmother and it being just a TV, and every time was a TV, and they were all sat in a room together.
It's a waiting room.
More or less just, waiting. And it was just so depressing. And so you don't want to go and be part of that because you don't know how to change it. You don't know how to physically get out of yourself and stop thinking about how embarrassing you might feel or if you start singing. But I think that was one of the things that we did was just one Christmas we started singing Christmas carols. And that's when we discovered that my grandmother knew all the songs, and then everybody else in the room knew the songs, and it was a really beautiful moment.
That's really touching.
Will you catch me if I fall through the city noise?
This is the album's title track, Awake But Always Dreaming.
Will you take me if I call to the hillside?
there's so many things that you do. Like I was saying, you wear so many hats, and theatre work is another one. So yeah, you wrote the score for Brighton Rock. How is that for you as a composer?
Oh, I loved it. It was 2 months living in York, more or less, writing and then rehearsing and getting the show up with live musicians and letting it then go on, taking it on tour and letting it breathe its own way through. The creative team were just very open-minded. You know, it was not kind of stuck in a certain era. I was not told, you know, you have to do it in this style or anything, so I was given free rein to how I interpreted the main character, the protagonist of Pinky, this like teenage boy who was very disturbed, on the path to being a complete psychopath. For me, it was really important to kind of take those feelings out of his brain and to kind of transform them into the music.
Cool.
The dark, pulsing synths, the live drums, the effects. I recorded a choir and sampled every note of them singing in New York. So then could play that live on stage.
Wicked.
And it was really like magical in that sense.
So, were you devising at the same time as things were being worked out? Yeah,
so I had a lot of I'd more or less written I don't know, let's say 15 pieces of music before we started rehearsals. And then when we went into rehearsals, as the actors were kind of devising everything through with the script, myself and this wonderful drummer called James Field, who is also a genius at Ableton and computers and MIDI triggers and everything, worked up some tunes to kind of underscore some of the scenes more directly. So we had a lot of stems to choose from and took that as the basis for stuff. So yeah, it was devised more or less half in the studio, half in the rehearsal room.
I imagine it being quite stressful. Fun, but stressful.
I don't know. I think it's...
Was it not?
I don't know. I'm really used to it. I think as a session musician, you're thrown things straight away. Play this, and you have to come up with that sound and play it straight away. And I think that for me in the theatre, it was just more enjoyable. If I'd have not gone there with loads of kind of prep, I would have struggled. But the fact that I knew what sounds and what synths and what to use was quite a nice way of going, oh, I'll just pick that. Here's my wardrobe for today.
That's a nice way of looking at it. That's a really good analogy for being an electronic musician in a situation that needs to be malleable, because you do have to prepare things, don't you? You need to know what's in your wardrobe. I love that. As there's no official recording of Hannah's score for Brighton Rock, this track is Octavia, and it can be heard on both the Awake But Always Dreaming album and the trailer for Brighton Rock. So it's as close as we're going to get to hearing anything from that score. What is next? You've been nominated.
Oh yeah.
Northern Ireland Music Prize, right?
Yeah, that's in a few weeks.
It's soon, yeah. This might go out afterwards, so either congratulations or commiserations. But
either way, we're all winners.
All winners, exactly. I checked out who you're up against, and it's quite a voice-led song-based?
Very different.
You really do stand
Yeah.
out from that bunch.
Yeah, and I'm not expecting to walk away with a trophy, but I was nominated last year for a very song-led album, and that didn't cut through. The result was a very traditional Irishy singer-songwriter.
Yeah.
And that might be the same case for this year.
Like, if you're a bit of a curveball at this time.
Yeah, who knows? But I don't know. I think I do feel like Northern Ireland has an amazing music scene, and since kind of being there a lot more this year, I've met a lot more of those people and a lot more of what is going on, and that I think in the next few years we're going to see like a real kind of bulge of music coming from there that is a lot more experimental. And,
wicked.
and I just think that it's on the verge of that, whereas maybe before, because of the music industry, it's been kind of held back by only producing people that can do singer-songwriters and have albums. I think people are starting to experiment a bit more, and it's good.
That's cool. So let's do some housekeeping. Any plugs?
Ooh, there will be an album next year,
Yes, great.
but I'm not allowed yet to say, depending on when your podcast goes out. I don't know if I'm allowed to announce it or not. But it's very special, and it was made in a very, very short period of time.
Oh.
So rather than like scoring something for months and months and months, it was done within like 12 hours.
Oh, wow.
So it's a really exciting album to be part of.
Yeah.
So that's coming out next year.
I'm excited to hear that.
Yeah.
These podcasts normally have like the music making part. Would you ever do a full episode?
Yeah.
The full shebang?
Well, for this next record, when you find out about what it's about, we'll do that.
Yes. Okay, I'm
Because
excited.
I think the people that are involved will be really up for that as well.
Thank you so much for checking out this extra episode, the first one of these, and thanks to Hannah for being the first guest involved in them. I'm sure you've all enjoyed listening to extracts of her music. I think it's totally brilliant, forward-thinking modern music with a lot of heart. If you were unaware of Hannah's music before, then I hope you're somewhat of a fan now and will continue to listen. As Hannah is so well read about the subjects that inform her music, I wrote to her and asked for a couple of links to put in the description of this podcast so that you can read more about some of the topics that have been talked about in this episode. Being the modern musician that she is, she has all of her social medias in order, and can you believe it, she even has a website. That's hannahpeel.com, and you can find her on Twitter, hanpeel with one N. Both Facebook and Instagram are Hannah Peel Music. If this is your first time listening to Excuse the Mess, there's an entire Series 1 available, hours and hours of stuff there that you can go back and enjoy. These extra episodes are here to keep us entertained between Series 1 and 2. Well, keep me entertained anyways. If you want to know more, if you want to sign up to the mailing list, you can go to etmpodcast.com, etmpod on Twitter, and etmpodcast on Instagram. And do give us a subscribe on your podcast apps so you can see any new episodes coming in. Thank you to you for being here, checking out this podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it. And as promised earlier in the episode, here's that recording of Hannah's grandfather placed into the world of Mary Casio. See you soon.